we first of all acknowledge that this is Gadigal land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge the stewardship of the land, of that land, by their elders, past and present. My name's Stuart Rees. I'm the current chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation, which, among other things, awards Australia's only international prize for peace. And peace. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to foreshadow what's going to happen during the rest of the evening. I'm going to explain something about the criteria that the Peace Prize jury uses and has used for the past 15 years to select the prize winner. And then I'm going to invite the 2012 Peace Prize recipient to the stage, and I'm going to explain in front of her and in front of you why she was chosen. After Senator Sekai Holland gives the Peace Prize lecture, the Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Robin Kemmis, will come to the stage and thank Sekai on behalf of the city and on behalf of this audience. Okay, 60 seconds about the Peace Foundation, which is an alliance formed about 16 years ago between people in the corporate world, the media, the community sector, and academia to, among other things, award a prize for that most precious commodity, peace. The three yardsticks that the jury uses, and the jury is usually 7 or 8 people from all walks of life who sit down around about August for about 3 months to mull over the nominations. And the three criteria are, first of all, evidence that a nominee is committed to peace with justice globally, not just locally. The second yardstick concerns a commitment to universal human rights. And the third yardstick is about evidence or the use of the philosophy, the language, and the practice of nonviolence. Well, that's enough of the sort of abstract. Now, let me ask you to welcome to the stage the prospective recipient of the Sydney Peace Prize, because the prize is awarded tomorrow night. Senator Sekai Holland from Zimbabwe. Is that okay? I've just given you a sort of abstract of how the jury scratches its head and deliberates. But to put some flesh on those abstract notions, you might have read seen or read three pieces of excellent mainstream journalism in the past couple of weeks. I mention that because there's a sense in which the mainstream journalists are struggling against the people's fascination with the internet. First of all, there was a wonderful documentary on SBS's Dateline by the talented Yara Boumala. Secondly, there was a typically brilliant article by Nikki Barraclough in The Good Weekend. And if you saw the Dinner with Sekai article in the news review section of the Herald by Deborah Snow, you will have got a load of more precious insights into this formidable lady. If that's not enough, when Sekai's name was announced, I received a letter from a Zimbabwean lady called Patricia Gumbira, who said, "Thank you for choosing Sekai. She saved my life. She saved the life of many other people. Despite the terrible violence, and they gave her hell, she didn't resist. She is a hero of mine." And I think the jury somehow knew that and took that into account. And if those comments are not enough, you only had to look across the Twitter or tweeter screen, I'm never sure exactly what it is, during the ABC's Q&A program 10 days ago, when, with the greatest respect to the politicians, Sekai had them for breakfast. But there were three particular comments that confirmed the wisdom of the jury. One said, Sekai Holland is a wonderful model for all women. Another said, I hope the politicians around the world are watching. And the third said, why don't we invite her to become the first president of the Republic of Australia? Well, I'm not entitled to invite you to be a president, but I am entitled to invite you to give the 2012 City of Sydney Peace Prize lecture.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Before the children go to sleep, I just wanted to say something to them first, which is, even before I do it, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Great Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, and pay sincere respect to their elders, past and present, and hope that the great universal force which looks after all of us is here tonight to make this evening successful. Thank you. So I wanted to say to the children, in 1985, we went to a women's summit in Nairobi where women were celebrating womanhood, but also trying to understand the way forward for women. It was a United Nations conference. And standing by the lake, a discussion took place in a hotel, a lake hotel. What the world really was trying to do in having these summits. We started an organization there called Black Women Cross-Culturally. I've been asked to take off my earring. That organization met in New York for the first time. The structure was that there was a director and two people who helped as co-conveners to discuss the trajectory in the world for the most oppressed women. The woman who impressed us most there was a woman called Titifai Harawira from, as we were told, Ayatora. There's no New Zealand. And the next conference was held in Zimbabwe, and the co-convener there was a woman from here called Dulcie Flower. Our dream, an Aboriginal woman, islander from here, our dream throughout these processes was to get the world to see our story. And tonight, children, you gave us that story. And I want to thank all the children that performed here, because for me, Dr. Andre McLaughlin, who started this thing, if she was here, and she's not, she would have said, we done it. Thank you very much. Because we are in Australia, the talk will really dwell more on things that we achieved here, which really prepared us to then go to Zimbabwe, Jim and I, to actually then undertake the arduous tasks we've been taking right now. So don't be disappointed if there's nothing much on Zimbabwe, but ask any questions you want about that. So the title of my speech is Celebrating Our Diversity as we build an inclusive society for our own protection, the generations now, and for generations to come in Zimbabwe, because inclusivity really is a shield to all sorts of catastrophes. The Sydney Peace Prize program that followed my selection as the nominee made a positive impact on networks in Zimbabwe because of the manner in which the Sydney Peace Prize Collective managed the whole process. This process started with an email from Professor Stuart Rees notifying me that I was the choice for the 2012 Sydney Peace Prize. This news was followed by a 4-person high-level delegation that visited Zimbabwe, which included the director of the Sydney Peace Foundation, the president of the Zimbabwe Information Center in Sydney, and a young, talented, very impressive award-winning journalist from SBS Dateline, Yara. They came to Zimbabwe to see my work and to make an announcement at the Australian Embassy in Harare that I was the 2012 winner of the prize. That really made a big impact to us because we had not really understood the importance of the prize. The subsequent visit to Zimbabwe by Nikki Baraclow, I hope that's the right pronunciation, of the Sydney Morning Herald herself, another very distinguished journalist, made me realize the seriousness of the award. Stories published on our work have put Zimbabwe's peace process on the map in a positive footing at home and internationally. New connections in these processes that have been taking place between and among the old and the young in Zimbabwe, among political and civil society networks in Zimbabwe, have really been consolidated with the Australian Embassy in Harare. And hopefully, the Sydney Peace Foundation will develop these and strengthen them for themselves, because that cross-pollination is quite critical. Zimbabweans live in a land that should be the envy of the world. That's chauvinist, of course, but we believe that. We have a wide range of natural resources, as well as extensive man-made, person-made infrastructure. We have spectacular scenery and wildlife. We have a good climate, and above all, we have a well-educated and capable population. The question, of course, which Jim and I, Jim being my spouse and husband and best friend, the question would be, why then has Zimbabwe ranked, not last, but at the bottom, in the Happy Planet Index for both 206 and 209? We are moving up a bit, but very slowly, we are still at the bottom. Why is that in a country like that? In asking that question, we have focused all the work we do in trying to understand how to get the mindset of Zimbabweans put in a way that we are able to enjoy, as the people in Zimbabwe, those God-given aspects or those natural aspects given to us by nature. I'll start my answer to that question as well by giving a brief reminder to the goal of the liberation wars in Zimbabwe, which the Australians who were at that time participants, and I hope some are here tonight, everybody knew what the liberation war in Zimbabwe was about, because we were very vocal about how bad the Rhodesians were and how what we were going to do was going to be so much better. The context of the liberation war in Zimbabwe really was to eradicate secular colonial rule during the era of the Winds of Change statement made by Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of England, in 1960, when he traveled through Africa from Cape Town. He talked about the winds of change in Africa. And not many people, especially the secular colonialists and the white governments which were there, they didn't really understand that very much. But Ghana, in 1960, got its independence. So the goal of the liberation war was to end secular colonial rule, gain independence, establish majority rule, and establish a just system where the majority ruled itself or governed itself. The demand was for all to vote, everybody to vote without conditions. And freedom was the hallmark of the nationalists. It was freedom for all now. One person, one vote. Freedom was understood by all as the right of all citizens to lead their lives without undue interference. And of course, the majority government was going to do that for everybody. But the history of Zimbabwe is of a country conquered by violence and ruled by violence, and where power is maintained by violence because there is a coercive machinery that is inherited by successive governments and elites to keep the population down, to keep the elites really accumulating and doing well, and to actually ensure that there is no change except as the elites wish. The arrival of independence and the presidency of Robert Gabriel Mugabe has made some gains, but this coercive machinery under his watch is there, and it's refined, and it's working. Now, the major achievements of the nationalists, however, was that they waged a sustained and relentless fight for freedom and independence I was part of that struggle here in Australia with a lot of really good, solid comrades from around the world. But the story of liberation in Zimbabwe today omits a lot of vital information. Up to this day, there is no access to accurate information on who participated in that war in Zimbabwe and outside Zimbabwe for Zimbabwe, how it was fought, the difficulties faced by all sections involved, and how these challenges eventually produced independence. That information is not there. Such information, if put in the public domain in Zimbabwe, would allow for the development of appropriate policy frameworks with programs, appropriate programs that would address the urgent and neglected needs of those who truly participated in the liberation, but more importantly, those who were in Zimbabwe supporting the liberation struggle, who really had hoped for a better dispensation. This information being put in the public domain would open the way for the country to move forward. You have to know the past, deal with the present, and plan for the future. I would like to really thank Australians, because in a way, this is a thank you for all the hard work that the youths in the 60s and 70s did towards the liberation of Zimbabwe. The Australian government support for Zimbabwe. I now want to identify contributions made by Australian campaigners for justice to our struggle for freedom in Zimbabwe. Australia's support for Zimbabwe goes back to the period of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which was dissolved in 1963, because the territories of the North, Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia, did not like it. And so in 1963, it had lasted 10 years. The breakup led to us in Zimbabwe falling under the tutelage of Ian Smith with his brighter, whiter Rhodesia, as was the slogan of the Rhodesia Front. For a brighter, whiter Rhodesia, vote Rhodesia Front. I couldn't believe my eyes, but that was the slogan. The 1960s and 1970s in Australia were also times when change was taking place within the Australian society and around it. Support groups of different causes emerged. Australia had a strong Australian Council of Churches, which was linked to the World Council of Churches in Geneva. As far back as the early 70s, the World Council of Churches had a department to combat racism, which took this matter very seriously. The World Council of Churches had programs of action that gave support to organizations that fought racism around the world. And their visit to Australia by Charles Spivey and Brigelia Bam really consolidated the work on racism and actually brought together the work of the people who were working on Southern Africa and the people working on indigenous matters here and island matters closer, because they had come to investigate the situation of the Aboriginal and island people in this country. And I think it was in 1971. Churches also provided support. The invitation had come from the Australian Council of Churches. And the Australian Council of Churches at that time was very central in breaking a lot of barriers and opening Australia for things to happen. Churches also provided support to vulnerable local youths and young people. There was at the Wayside Chapel in King's Cross, Reverend Ted Knopfs, who was the founder and chief executive of the Wayside Chapel. In those days, young Gary Foley from Redfern and a young Reverend Bill Cruz were the young staff members at the Wayside Chapel who carried out support programs for needy youths. And of course, we linked with them at that time. Our parents and their extended family network in Zimbabwe raised our family. There was no nuclear family when I grew up. Our parents, their brothers and sisters brought the children together, made collective decisions on how they would educate us, where we would go, and how that would help us. This extended family network all had strong mission education, and they all had a strong mission to instill positive values in all of us for the next generation, with nonviolence as the basis for support, for success in life. Their circle, our parents, were all mission educated. Both our parents were trained teachers who received their education at Mnene and Masase Swedish Lutheran missions. I'm still a good Lutheran today at home. And our church has sent somebody who is in this audience today, Mrs. Christine Mwamwanda, so that she can witness what is happening with the Sydney Peace Prize. The Swedish Lutheran missions are in Berengwa district, and my mom came through Mchabezi Mission, a London Missionary Society school where they trained teachers. Our extended family believed that education for their daughters and sons was the key to success in life in the new dispensation. They instilled in us a very strong understanding that we were all equals and that we were not superior or inferior to anybody, and that we had to really go into the world knowing that we were the best, we had the best, and humanity was the best, and that the best invention of humans was language, and they used to say, use it. We were sent to missions where those values were further reinforced. My personal experiences in Australia then reinforced those values and influenced my commitment to nonviolence and to struggles to achieve basic human rights. Meanwhile, here in Australia, in the 1960s, Sir Robert Menzies' government, which was well connected with the mother country, the United Kingdom, actually introduced a very good program called the Special Commonwealth Africa Assistance Program, which was similar to the Colombo Plan for Asia. And I am a beneficiary of that. And because of that program, I arrived in Australia on Australia Day in 1964. When asked where I wished to stay in Australia, I chose to be placed in an institution that trained missionaries. Of course, I was at the mission school when I made that request. Didn't know what was on the other side. But now that I know Australia, this must have caused some smiles and really wonder among the grant providers in both Rhodesia and Australia. I was housed at Deaconess House in Fairfield in Melbourne under the watchful eye of Deaconess Elizabeth Alfred, who became the Reverend Elizabeth Alfred. I think she's still in a home in Upper Victoria. I'm still trying to get in touch with her. I will. She kept that watch over me, and I believe she's keeping a watch over me today, because when we were tortured, the first letter that came was from Reverend Elizabeth Alfred. Australia itself was undergoing change at that time, as I have said. Following a brief news item which reported my arrival in Melbourne to take my matriculation, I received invitations from Australian viewers who sensed what obstacles I might face in settling in my new environment. I think from the way I answered the questions, they got very worried. People opened their doors to me and included me as a family member. They made my arrival in Australia an enjoyable and exciting learning experience. They all shared with me their thoughts on their country, giving me an invaluable insight into my new surroundings. The first family that invited me into their home had a delightful, inquisitive daughter who followed us everywhere as the mother and father showed me the house and the yard. When I went to sleep, exhausted, the little girl was still very much hypercharged. She said, good night, and then, can I give you a hug? We did. Then she stood outside, and I heard her saying to her parents, is she a pixie? Referring to me. I was surprised, but also amused by her choice of creature, that she placed me in this mythical world that I had been raised reading about. It was me now that was a pixie. On reflecting, I realized that the child was merely reflecting on her society's norms about black people. She had not met a black person before, but I thought her experience with a black person that day had really been nice for her to ask that question, hopefully that they would say yes. Then she would come in and ask for some other things. The parents were embarrassed, and I felt very sorry for them because I thought that child really was the best. I was never invited there again. It was such a relief that the next connection worked very well. Australian missionaries of the London Missionary Society, my mother's church, in Zimbabwe, gave me the name of a contact in Melbourne where I was to study. It was a young couple, Jim and Meryl Webb. Jim and Meryl Webb were a very incredible couple in 1964 for me. They had a vision, each of their own, for this country. The vision for Jim Webb was on building Australia's future relationships with countries in the region. On a chance meeting, I met Jim Webb with his 6-year-old son, Richard. Now that I got to know the family, I suspect it was young Richard who spotted me first, also based on the little girl inquiring if I was a pixie. Not that Richard thought I was a pixie. He was much smarter than that. I think he must have spotted me and said to his dad, look at that. Because when we got off, he came to ask me if I was Sekai. I said yes. I was promptly invited home, where I met Meryl and little Jeffrey, the younger son, who took me in as their own. And that relationship was invaluable, because the focus of the Webbs was on the education of their own children inside the house and outside, and of young Australians to become acquainted with Australia's Asian neighbors. And for Meryl, it was for Australian indigenous plants. That family worked tirelessly in a very difficult environment, recruiting, orienting, sending young people as volunteers to countries to the north of Australia, very energetically and with a real conviction. Jim Webb was working for the Australian volunteers abroad. They invited me as one of their regular speakers in their orientation program for these young white volunteers going off to work in Asia, in Papua New Guinea, as it was known there. They quickly introduced me to their best friends, Ian and Barbara Spalding, the opposite of the Webbs. They were very focused on their 3 little daughters, Rebecca, Harriet, and Ellen, who I adopted as my very own baby nieces, and we had wonderful times. The Spalding's focus was really Ian's focus on the role of Australians and their responsibilities to the appalling situation of the Aboriginal people. I was very lucky to meet these 2 families, because immediately they made me understand Australia's worry that they should be engaged with Asia and the Pacific, and Ian made me understand that Australians were not that brilliant. They had this bad situation they were not looking at of the indigenous Australians. So those 2 families really focused me. There was another family that I became a part of. This was a retired English couple, the Alcocks, with their beautiful daughters, Prue and Georgie. Prue became my matron of honor when Jim and I got married. Georgie was to provide us with our son's baby, Claude's Kudzo, when he arrived. The Alcocks had settled in Melbourne after their life as technocrats in East Africa. And we had some wonderful, wonderful days in their home, having discussions, which were actually big arguments, and small agreements about the role of colonialists in Africa. However, they were really fantastic that they wanted me to focus on my work, helped me to actually focus on the difficult subjects I was doing, and with selection of, they were very good. I also made very good friends at Taylor's. At Taylor's, the school where I went to. In Taylor's, there was a mature student called Elizabeth Doxey, who had 2 children. Her has 3. Her husband had been killed in the Second World War, and they took me into their home with her 2 sons and her little daughter, Steve and Richard. The evenings with them were just wonderful, because they were always relating how life was when Daddy was there. And there was a certain sadness which they were overcoming, that Daddy didn't come back from the Second World War. So the impact of the Second World War on Australian families was quickly made to me at the very beginning, as Elizabeth talked about her life. I had to focus on what I had, Then really the final person I want to talk about is Gwen Williams, a dentist. She was in her 30s, I didn't know that, until a catastrophe happened. Gwen gave me sound advice on how to respond to boys who showed interest in me. She didn't realize that the Catholics, where I'd been educated from the time I was 9, had already done the job. And she really wanted me to focus on what I'd come to Australia to do, and she would say, you must study. Look at me, I'm a dentist. Anyway, one day I was in class, and I was told that Gwen had been killed in a parachuting accident because she was a parachutist in a club. Her parachute refused to open. Her family gave me her bracelet, beautiful silver, which I treasure to this day. We missed Gwen. For me, it was her advice, which was very, very much emboldened in my head, where the Catholics had failed to make that clear. The families in Melbourne were my first real base of support in this new country of study. To this day, those families are a network of my life and Jim's life. They made my initiation into Australia enjoyable and positive. And 3 days ago, we had the pleasure of meeting Prue's boys and Roy's boys, and to hear the sad news that my matron of honor, Prue, and her husband, Roy, had died. We were very, very sad to hear that, but the boys are here tonight, and thank you for coming. The Australian National University experience consolidated my sense of where I needed to go in my life. There, I met some wonderful friends, the Moped girls, Nancy and Kate. Their parents, when we came to Sydney to their home, were serious bushwalkers and cavers. They were environmentalists. And the information they used to give us every time we visited used to shock me, because they were talking about what people are talking about today. This was 1965, the preservation of the earth. I'm really glad to say Nancy has kept with us. Unfortunately, we failed to get the other girls, Jill and Gillian, who were also from here, who were very good friends, and who took me to church whenever we were here, because very few people here wanted to see that door. Anyway, I met my husband, Jim, at that university, and we were part of a study circle, and we really realized when we started going that we needed to start to make very serious plans. Jim completed his arts degree in Canberra. We moved to Sydney so that he could study engineering, and all my attempts to get Jim to study in Melbourne fell on his deaf ears because he wanted to come to Sydney. And I'm very glad we came to Sydney, because here, Jim's family, Jim's godfather, oh, they were so wonderful. There are so many that really, if I start reading the names, we are going to be here. They were very nice, and they really made life for me very, very nice. His godfather was forced to actually take us as his children. I think he's a well-known figure, Sir John Carrick, Jim's godfather, and we are very grateful to him for a lot of care that he took on us, especially at the times when we were activists. Anyway, in my lifetime, I have also watched the great journey that Australia has taken to put race relations right in your own country. And I must say, a lot of progress has been made, a lot of exciting changes have been made, and of course, the fire, I think, started at the 1967 referendum that allowed Aboriginal people to be counted as citizens. I was a young student at the Australian National University. I remember it as a very exciting time meeting charismatic stars of that movement for change, Faith Bangla, Darcy Flower, John Newfong. I mean, the list is long. And these people had a very difficult time, which really not many people understood, in trying to organize and formally really make people in a country like this come to understand what they needed to do. I have a long list in this speech, those who will want to see it. There were so many of them, passionate, articulate, sophisticated, and they came forward and led the change. And it was really a very exciting time when the Aboriginal people came out and made that push. The referendum sparked a revolution in the lives of Aboriginal people. Injustice and discrimination were called. Even the introduction of the speech today, recognizing the people and their land, that was something that was fought for, and people really want that, and it's part of what we put now when we come as foreigners as something that they won. Jim and I moved to Sydney and fell in with the Red Fern group, the clan here, where we saw these changes firsthand through our many friendships and new possibilities in the lives around us. And it was those strategies that we saw used here that we took to Zimbabwe, which is why we are still alive, because we learned how to survive. And yet, when I was preparing this speech, I was shocked to discover that the work that you began here so earnestly and so well in 1967 is incomplete. Australia's constitution still does not recognize the first Australians of this land. And to this day, it contains elements that allow for racial discrimination. I say to you as a friend, this situation cannot stand. Australian people are far too brilliant to sit with something like that. It has to change. Your friends, and Australia has many friends, because I must say here, the diplomats who are sent to Zimbabwe are at the top end of the best, and they've done a fantastic job of actually connecting Australia to Africa. As I speak, the biggest AusAid office was opened by the head of AusAid from Canberra in Harare, and we really enjoy very, very good relations with the Australian ambassador. When I went to say goodbye to him, and I was singing the praises of the achievements of Australians on the front of race relations, Matthew said to me, actually, don't be so enthusiastic. I think if you look more closely, there may be some elements. I said, oh, be quiet. I know. You think you haven't done enough? Oh, Australians have done very well. So I have news for him. He was right. Solidarity groups for struggles in Australia and abroad. In 1969, Sydney was awash with a diversity of interesting people who were organized around different struggles within and outside Australia. Relevant to us as Zimbabweans was John Brink's bookshop. A South African, John Brink and his wife, Meg Brink, were activists in South Africa who came to Australia in 1961. But who, when they were in South Africa itself, worked in non-violent based organizations to eradicate apartheid. In their home country, South Africa, Meg Brink was an active member of the South Africa's Black Sash, a group of very brave white women. Now in Australia, both were at the core of the Southern Africa Defence and Aid Fund, which organized along the lines of the British organizations. Australians of the past were very linked to the mother country. And the Australians who were not at the top were not really as connected as that. So for us, we were very much connected to those who were connected to the mother country, because in Zimbabwe, we were with the mother country. The 1972 victory of Gough Whitlam, is it 72 or 73? Okay, led Labour after 27 years in the opposition with their theme, It's Time for Change, which is the name of the movement for democratic change. We are called Machinja, which means the agents of change. So that slogan there, Machinja, we are not going to say we chose it from there because it came from the Zimbabweans. Anyway, it led this victory to the first concrete solidarity movement victory when Prime Minister Gough Whitlam announced the banning of all sporting ties with South Africa until South Africa achieved democracy. I remember the next day Meredith ringing around, saying, what are we going to do? We were all too tired. And she was also too tired to be asking such a question. And of course, things were to map themselves for us to move forward with the struggle then for democracy. Indeed, it is a fact that regular sporting ties with South Africa were only resumed by Australia when President Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa in 1994. John and Meg Brink promoted and advocated the ending of apartheid non-violently. Their entire lives revolved around activities to educate Australians on apartheid and to get people from Southern Africa to actually understand their role as well once we got here. The board was made up of an inclusive group of older persons who were committed and loyal to the cause. Through this group, we met students who were working on sports against the South African Springboks based on the work of Dennis Brutus, Meredith Bergman, Dennis Freeney, a whole group of there. And I was very confused about that. Every time I mentioned, the people say, oh, those are comms, you can't be seen with communists. And of course, because we really had no fixation on any ideology. We just knew these were very nice people who were very, very, very good and very helpful. So even when we had the anarchists here, to us it didn't make anything, because the thing we were moving to was to remove apartheid, and they were doing that. Through them, we were able to have tours of people like Dennis Brutus and the young South African Peter Hain, who, when he arrived, we had banners, Rain, stop play, for rain. And we thought we were very smart to have slogans like that when we met him at the airport. It did rain. John Merkel and Peter McGregor worked with the Brinks Around campaigns against racism in sport. But as young people, they quickly realized that they had to go other ways. So John Merkel quickly launched the campaign against racism in sport, CARIS, while Peter McGregor launched the anti-apartheid movement to conscientize Australians on apartheid using activist methods, non-violent. Of course, in those days, the methods that were non-violent were then termed violent. People thought that they should not have been doing that, these people. The trade unions, academics, students, and left-wing political parties formed a formidable support movement which gave support against apartheid campaigns within Australia and abroad. The workers, the trade unions, were very central in what we were doing then. The ACT, Australian Council of Trade Unions, ACTU, have been and are crucial features of a healthy democracy. My unionist friends confronted issues of injustice, environmental protection, human rights. Those that were ahead in their thinking included the Builders Labourers Federation. And they led Australia, without a formal education really, into appreciating environmental issues as the importance of preserving historical buildings around the city, in the suburbs, and refusing to go and pull buildings down. I didn't understand this at first, but when I worked with them as a NIPA, I started to appreciate what this was all about, because they always educated all their members on why these things were being done. This union, in coordination with other unions, organized support for liberation movements in Africa. We really were very, very grateful that the unions at that time were able to do this and really instilled in us the culture of nonviolence. We were able to then establish the Free Zimbabwe Center. The way we did it was actually also something we did because we were students. When the need arose for Australian activist groups to focus attention on Zimbabwe, we campaigned against the existence of the Ian Smith Rhodesia Information Front at Crow's Nest. We developed a well-planned course of action to close down the center, as this was against the sanctions placed on Smith by Britain when Smith declared UDI in 1965. In 1973, a little group of 15 of us went to Crow's Nest. The whites went in front saying the Jim, and the others, my Jim, went in front to say they wanted to migrate to Rhodesia. Oh, they were so pleased they let them in. We then rushed in and invaded the place, got a call to the Queen that we'd taken this over to Gough Whitlam, to everybody, to say this was now the Free Zimbabwe Center. We took the documents from there and took the Rhodesia Information Center to the Supreme Court to say that they should not be in existence because they were contravening the sanctions. We took the Rhodesia Information Center to the High Court for its closure, and we won. The decision led to the Ian Smith regime closing their Rhodesia Information Centers in Portugal, the United States, and Australia, because that was, this is where, again, you respect democracy and where it is respected. We won, and they closed. No one was saying, oh, we are going to keep it because of this and this. With colleagues in Australia, we set up the Free Zimbabwe Center in our spare bedroom at Ruthven Street in Bondi Junction to publicize the undemocratic practices at home under the Smith regime and to popularize the work of the liberation movements in Zimbabwe. We built links with the Australian government to the day to prepare the ground for an independent Zimbabwe by negotiating for the increase in the numbers of scholarship, to train the growing numbers of Zimbabweans who were leaving the country, to return home after independence with the necessary skills required to develop the new Zimbabwe. I was the director of the Free Zimbabwe Center from 1971 to 1981. The Zimbabwe Center supported humanitarian, non-violent programs. We supported the liberation movements with that. And I want to pay tribute to the Freedom from Hunger, which later became something else, because when we then had our president, our chair of the liberation movements, Herbert Chitepo, asked what it was, when he was asked what it was he wanted, he said they needed a 3,000-hectare farm for all the people who had run away from home to come and do plowing. so that they could get their own food. Money was collected by the students. It was actually channeled through Freedom from Hunger, and a 3,000-acre farm was bought, hectare farm was bought in Zambia, and life for the guerrillas changed because their families were able to come and farm. And when we went to visit there, a couple of months later, after the farm was bought, there was a lot of activity. So for that, we have never been able to say thank you to Australia, because Australia was the only country at that time which was willing to have relations with ZANU. A culture of cooperation between and among diverse organizations developed. Such cooperation included the anti-Vietnam movement. Jose Ramos Horta arrived in our office as a 25-year-old to say he was from Timor. I said, where is that? Showed us on the map. We became firm friends and introduced him. The Free Zimbabwe Center introduced Jose Ramos Horta through the Australian Council of Churches and the Tanzanian government to Frelimo, and they were able to open an office in Mozambique as a result of that working together in Australia. In solidarity with the first Australians, the Kuris, the first organized indigenous organization we came across was Fakatsi, who successfully coordinated the 1967 referendum. Faith and her husband, Hans, and their beautiful young daughter, Lilona, really inspired everybody at that time. With a very difficult environment, they worked with SADF, John Brink, and all the people working in the anti-apartheid movement to effectively coordinate the Springbok tours, the anti-Springbok tours. And at that time, and this story is not told, when the Wallabies here refused to play with the Springboks and really became lepers, Anthony Abrahams and them, it was 7 young Kuri activists who they gave, it might be another number, Springbok jerseys to run onto the field during the match of the Springboks and the Wallabies. That really disgusted the South Africans and actually made them realize that the struggle against apartheid included the first Australians. It was at the time when the Redfern community rose up and approached the best brains in the country to support them in establishing new institutions to deliver services among the Kuris. Intellectuals and professionals like Professor Fred Hollows were taken in and they did the Aboriginal medical service. Professors Hal Wooton, Professors Garth Natham worked with setting up the Aboriginal legal service. And you had Dr. Carlo Carinos working with the children's services. And all these services really have been a pleasant surprise because they've been sustainable. The Aboriginal medical service is still there. The Aboriginal legal service is still there. They had an Aboriginal housing cooperative, a theater, and these vital initiatives really showed us the first Australians at their best. The story at this time was of Dr. Archie Carlo Carinos. This remains stuck in my mind. And because I would like this story recorded because of what it did with the Aboriginal women, because I don't see it written anywhere. Dr. Carlo Carinos was a doctor who worked very much with the Outback. And he was always in court defending Aboriginal women who were being accused of abusing their children. And his argument was, no, these Aboriginal women are not abusing their kids. What's happening is that the children have a vitamin C deficiency caused by the mucus lining being removed because of the diet introduced by the settlers when they came. And the diet was sugar, tea, and flour, sugar, and tea. And there was no milk. I think this was for the stockmen in the Outback. And that this anomaly led to ear problems, eye problems, and breathing problems for children, which was not acknowledged. He never actually did win very much until he really took very seriously the inclusion of people in the middle class within the community to take children in and do an experiment with him where they took vitamin C until they were 3 years old. It was really quite exciting that this proved his case. And Dr. Carinos, to me, is one of the heroes of the struggle because as a single campaigner, he educated many of us in those dark days, very dark days. There were many, many stories I can tell, but I really would like to talk now about our return to Zimbabwe. Our activist experiences in Australia prepared us for our return home. But the Smith regime did not provide a smooth transitional program to educate and prepare the incoming nationalist government, nor did the British actually do that as well. The change from white rule to black rule did not remove the negative elements of colonial rule. These negative components include just the way we conduct our affairs, the language we use, the clothes we wear, and the manner in which we act in the public domain, but also we have kept the coercive machinery of violence. The negative elements of colonial rule, such as the use of violence against your own citizens and of minority rule, have been reinforced in the new dispensation. And that's what has caused opposition party after opposition party to actually arise, and this time to stick, in spite of the outside world thinking what's happening is not happening well. When we returned home, my husband and I and our 2 children, we rode bicycles to work in a line of 4. Jim in front, me, our son, and our daughter, and then sometimes Jim would go behind. And this caused a lot of anger among the elite, and I got a lot of abuse to actually go and buy a car. Really, the truth of the matter was Jim and I didn't have money to buy a car. But we also really just enjoyed riding to work, and for the children to ride to work. And it caused a lot of anger until my bicycle and my daughter's were stolen inside the house. They left Jim's and my son's. They continued to ride, but we had to find a way of getting to school and to work. The dress code for formal occasions was at that time left as it was by the whites. The fight to remove what the secular colonialists left us is going to be a very difficult task, because there are some very good things they brought, but there are some very negative things, and together with them, we need to keep the good ones and remove the bad ones. Jim and I found that we had to fall back on our skills when we got there, because then at that time, Jim came and lived with my family in the rural areas and identified water and sanitation as the main things, went and really established the mechanisms, and over 10 years, did some brilliant work with the EU, took his pension, taught himself about IT, with a group of friends from UZ, the churches, NGOs. You can't do without the churches in Zimbabwe. They set up Mango, the first email service in the country, which is there today. And his third project now, this particular Mango was in our house for 21 years, and it played a very important service at the time of the farms being taken, because Mango was able to train old white farmers who'd lost their farms to use internet and email their children who had left. And there were our lounge and dining room and 1 bedroom were like a drop-in center for many people. Until I became a minister, then they got an office somewhere. But Jim has now registered an NGO, Fair Go for Kids, which is to teach children internet from the rural areas, not internet, but email and all that, so that they are mainstreamed into, and use of solar energy into the main society. The skills that have led us to do that, we learned right here. The new political order in Zimbabwe, unhappily, uses the same methods of the former white elite in their response to disagreement. We arrived home in the middle of 1980, in the middle of what was called Entumbane. This is an example. This refers to the violent process by guerrilla soldiers from Zipra, who were unhappy over the way they were treated when being included into New Zimbabwe Army. Because there was no system of discussing things and really coming to understand how to do these things properly, because there was some agenda. Of course, the British had a hand in it, which had to be stuck to so that the coming together worked. There was no room for bringing a new system of discussion, agreement, consensus building, and moving on. In line with the secrecy of anything military, which is another inherited thing, you don't talk about military secrets. No clear data has ever been provided on the causes of Entumbane or how it was eventually put down, because we all have these rumors of what happened. The next years saw the gruesome Kukurahundi, an assault by the military on an unarmed civilian group or society. For people who were being attacked were suspected members of ZAPU around the whole country. Gukurahundi was not just confined to Matabeleland and Midlands, it was a national attack on anybody suspected of being ZAPU. However, research on this part of our country's history has not been carried out. This has led to the belief that only the people of Matabeleland were affected by Gukurahundi and the people in the Midlands province. It is important for Zimbabweans to understand that Gukurahundi was a national attack on everybody who was suspected of not being ZANU. Arriving at such a conclusion would actually kill a lot of the animosity that brings tribalism as what was the reason for Gukurahundi in Matabeleland. It was actually the attack of a very strong opposition party that needed to go away. And if you look at all the attacks that are done after independence, it's on opposition people, opposition parties that are well organized. This tragic event of Gukurahundi was followed by the first post-independence of farm seizures. And unfortunately, because the information is not there in the public domain, the white community doesn't know that the Zipra combatants put $50 of their money, which they got for being discharged from the army. They put it together and bought 12 commercial farms so that they would then have cooperatives, because they had been trained in Soviet Union, most of them. These were actually taken over by the government, and up to this day, they have not been given back to them, which means that the people who put out their money for these farms to be established so they could have a livelihood were left derelict again, like the people from the other Gukurahundi things. The next development, while people were focused on what this was, and there was no public information, was the removal of the remaining white farmers, most of them who bought the farms after independence, when there was an invitation for people to come to Zimbabwe to actually farm by the president of the country. This removal of the whites left 1 million farm workers, and they lost their homes and lost their livelihoods. This, again, is not put in focus. The exercise removed the MDC voting base and the support base. And again, this attack was not on race. It was on people's voting pattern. And once that thing is actually understood in Zimbabwe, we are going to get a lot of energy to move forward, realizing that it is how you think which gets you attacked, not what your ethnic group is, not what your race is. In response to all these attacks in post-independent Zimbabwe, the public has now really come together and say to themselves, we are going to get change, which is why you get Machinja, us, because we are really going to get change. The citizens' response to the new rule of attacking people who think differently, who want to go forward. In one of his rallies, fortunately for people, President Mugabe lifted his fists and he declared, I have degrees in violence. We were so shocked because we never thought that we would hear this coming from a leader. He challenged those that did not like the ruling party to launch their own parties. What this did was civil society got together and did this research and found out what people really want, because they thought this statement was really unbearable. It was this that led to civil society rethinking the way forward in politics in Zimbabwe. The ZCTU was invited by the other NGOs to facilitate another research project on how civil society would move forward. The research research discovered some elements which made people decide to have a meeting at the Zimbabwe Women's Bureau, and there, civil society, facilitated by the ZCTU, decided to form another party based on democratic principles to actually come into the fore with multi-party democracy. That was when the MDC was formed. I remember being asked to come back home. I was in Rwanda, having retired. I had retired then. And listening to these people saying they are starting a new party, they invited me to do the women's thing. And I said to them, you'll get killed. Why do you want to do such a silly thing? I went back to Rwanda. They persuaded Jim to invite me back. I came. They were still on the party. Eventually, because they voted and the majority won, I agreed to help to actually start the new party in the women's wing. There are women's wings and youth wings, and the main wing is mainly the men. And few women struggle to get in there. When they do get in, they get kicked out, they fight back in. And we need to find another strategy. The resolution was to establish a new political party. A group of 10 was selected to provide the framework for the new party. I was the only woman in that group of 10, and I was representing women. The women's wing just needed one woman. After several months, we provided the framework based on the proceedings of the workshop. I became like a broken record saying, I want more women. If you increase and we have 7 men, then we can have 7 women. Or then we can, because we can't drop any men, said, okay, let's have another 8 women, so there are 9 women, and it didn't work. When the night before the first conference to set ourselves up, the men got together, established the structure, came up with a top 6. There was no woman had been kicked out. I stood for elections as challenging one of the men, knowing he was going to win. I got 1 vote. I made a statement to the women to say, women, don't fear positions. Challenge all posts. Because if you don't, we will always remain in the women's wings. Don't know why they're called wings. Among the key recommendations at that meeting in the Zimbabwe Women's Bureau and in the group of 10, we agreed that, because we were all from civil society, we agreed that any one of us who had attended that meeting can join the new party, but you had to resign from the position that you held in civil society to allow the new civil society to develop its own leadership, its own way of looking at things, and to be a watchdog to us as new politicians. There was a second suggestion, which was that every founding member had to go to their rural constituency and to actually spread the party to the rural areas. And the third, of course, decision was to ask the brave to take posts in the safe constituencies in the city. We didn't do a follow-up program to educate the brave so that they became an element of progressiveness inside the new parliament. The new party was launched on September 11, 1999, the first founding congress that followed in January 2000. And Peter Murphy from the Zimbabwe Information Center was at this founding congress, and he really gave one of the most powerful speeches on behalf of Australia. And up to this day, Peter Murphy and Meredith Bergman are hailed as heroes of the struggle. I think they think in Australia there are 2 people, Meredith Bergman and Peter Murphy, and now they know there's the Sydney Peace Foundation. The resolution passed in that Congress was for the new party to field candidates in all constituencies in the country. May 2000 elections were very difficult. You read about them. In spite of that, we did very well. The results were rigged, but the new party won a sizable number of seats, and even though they took some, we still were in parliament with a sizable opposition. The colonial culture of using violence to keep the population down was repeated during the elections of 2002, 2005, and 2008. Eventually, the MDC parties proposed a two-year inclusive. What happened was we have congresses, and in the 2006 Congress, we agreed that we would now spend the next 5 years getting the Mugabe government to come to a negotiating table, and for 2 years to have an inclusive government where we would stop the violence and erect a new people-friendly security sector force, which would actually help the country and really fight real enemies, which are not there because we are in SADC, where we are among friends. So what we did then was that we started a campaign called the Save Zimbabwe campaign, which was led by civil society, praying for Mugabe to come to the negotiating table, and of course, that was not listened to. It really was a big tragedy because the response of the government was then to attack the ZCTU, and I think you remember on television seeing Lucia Matibenga, a woman, being beaten up into a truck. She was the first vice president, first woman to be a first vice president of a ZCTU, and being tortured for several days. Little did we know in September then, 2006, that our going to actually continue the prayers for Mugabe to go would lead to the real torture of the leadership in 2007, March 11, when we were all tortured. However, this was for good fortune for us, because so disgusted was the AU, the African Union, that President Kikwete, who was the president of the AU, flew into Harare and demanded the Mugabe-led party to enter negotiations, which led to the birth of the Global Political Agreement, which is a peace declaration which calls on the three parties that one sits to actually, I've got 2 minutes left. That's Stuart. The response of the ZANU-PF, I have done that. The GPA has lasted 3 years. Stuart knows I'm coming to the end. The GPA has lasted 3 years and 9 months. That is victory. Yes, violence is still going on. However, it is now sporadic. We know somewhere people are organizing that, but the GPA has put in place mechanisms that are to dismantle the coercive machinery of violence. The GPA has lasted this time. It is the political trajectory of Zimbabwe that is actually being made here. It was signed by the three presidents of three political parties acting as the presidents of their parties, not as president, prime minister, and deputy prime minister. The important thing about the global political agreement is that incorporated in it are mechanisms of moving Zimbabwe from warmongering and using violence to peace and peace building. In the GPA, the organ for national healing, reconciliation, and integration is one of several new transitional arrangements created during the period of the GPA intended to facilitate the introduction and the laying of the foundations of a peace process, followed by peace-building measures based on our language, our culture, on our history, on our environment. The GPA has ably really laid these foundations, and the intention of the GPA is to end with free and fair elections according to the SADC norms and standards for free and fair elections. The political leadership has responded to ordinary Zimbabweans' demands for national healing, reconciliation, and integration. And I know that people may hear the president of Zimbabwe constantly talking about peace and think that that's a joke. Last year, at the opening of Parliament, President Mugabe in Parliament, when he opened Parliament, talked about peace. Our people were beaten quite badly outside. On that day, he was talking about peace. This year, he talked about peace when Parliament was opened. In fact, last week, there was no violence outside. He actually, on Independence Day, talked about peace. Slowly, I believe the message is getting there. People said to me, if you praise Mugabe, surely you will find that people will walk out. What Changirai says, the president of MDC-T, is Mugabe was part of the problem. For us to get these things to stick, he has to become part of the solution. Because for us to understand how violence works, the people that have been there using it must tell us, so we dismantle it together by agreement. Up to today, we have done everything by agreement. Because if he is not there, the big group of people who use violence will say, we were trained, you cannot tell us what to do. I have taken you on a very swift journey through a lifetime of campaigning for justice. In that journey, the influence of my parents' commitment to fairness, to public participation as a responsible citizen, and to social justice has been crucial. Those are the values that Jim's family also instilled in Jim, and Jim and I share these very much. And I want to salute Jim for coming to Zimbabwe with me and for us to have had these 32 years in a very difficult environment. The influence of my education in Australia has been a key of my commitment to peace with justice and has contributed to my skills in journalism, which I studied here. And in Zimbabwe, I worked as a founding member of the Zimbabwe Institute of Mass Communication. Of course, I came with what I had learned here to incorporate into that program. And segments of them, you can still see the DNA we put there. I really would like to salute the Zimbabwe Information Center, Dr. Meredith Bergman, Peter Murphy, and all the members of the Zimbabwe Information Center for the grand work that they have done with us in Zimbabwe and kept our souls, body and soul together. I also want to really say my solidarity here is with the Kuri people, the trade unions, the political, academic, our ex-Wallaby friends who really made the whole anti-apartheid sports against sports for good come to the fore. Because they were involved with us to good effect to confront violence and injustice in Zimbabwe. My references to the value of non-violence should have echoes around the world, not only in Zimbabwe, but in Syria, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, with our latest hero Malala and his father, and an appeal to really say to everybody, we need to talk about things. There is no enemy. Perpetrators and people who are victims need to actually understand that we need to sit down together and talk and not to actually fight on anything. There's nothing to fight against in this beautiful world. Wherever citizens suffer, that the whole issue of violence has to be removed, because in removing the issue of violence and the use of violence, we find the solutions are very easy to find. Worldwide violence against women should be outlawed. That is the key human rights goal. But really, it's violence against everybody. In that respect, I echo Mahatma Gandhi's notion when he said, I object to violence because even when it appears to do good, the damage it does is permanent. In New South Wales, I'm very scared of saying this, but again, I say this as a friend, that I have been very upset to see this story about the use of tasers in Australia. I saw the use of tasers in England, and I thought the mother country has not moved. But I was really shocked to arrive in Australia and see that tasers were being used here. And I need to make a point in this speech, really, for this whole thing, because if I don't, I won't sleep tonight. I need to make the point that people who have been committed to violence for generations find it difficult to speak and act non-violently. And in Zimbabwe, the biggest crack at the infrastructure for peace we have put up is that the people who are perpetrators understand that the African ethic of kusutisana fodla, okukhumela numlota, needs to have the steps of truth-telling, addressing the injustice of the person who has been badly done with, to restore them to have their life, and then forgiveness. Truth, justice, and forgiveness are the three stages for reconciliation. They now understand that. I noticed that worldwide, people who are in the place of perpetrating violence find it very difficult to talk about it and to act non-violently. That is a lesson for all of us. For here, I hope that the New South Wales Police, with their fascination for weapons such as tasers, or indeed for all the world, people in the world who think that arms trade contributes to security, let alone to civility, that they are wrong. And that we really need, as people of today, to say never, never again to violence in any form. My final thanks go to Professor Rees and his colleagues for their insistence not on peace, but on peace with justice. My thanks also go to successive diplomats that have served in Zimbabwe. They've been the best. And I want to salute Ambassador Matthew Newhouse and his wife Angela in Harare, because they're doing a fantastic job, and to their all staff and the AusAid. Let me also here say that since my arrival here, I have actually met my daughter, and I don't know if she's in the audience, and my grandson, and my daughter-in-law, but I just want to say to them, thank you for actually being here and doing the things you do, and for actually having took the principles you learned at home from your Kulu, your Koko, your Gogo, to actually do them here. I'd like to thank also my Mamanda, Mrs. Nongera, my young sister, who are here with me, and the people who are hosting them, to just say thank you for having come to be with me here, and Ambassador Zwambila, our ambassador, is here. I'd like to really thank her for taking that work very seriously and for really being here with us today. This whole Sydney Peace Prize has given Zimbabwe a very brilliant platform for us to talk about the peace process in Zimbabwe and to be able to talk about the bad in the past and present, knowing that Zimbabwe, at least Mugabe himself, really want us to have peace in Zimbabwe permanently, and that the Peace Prize gives us the platform to articulate that. Thank you very much.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.